Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Two Sons Podcast. It has definitely been a while. I don't remember the last time I actually recorded an episode. It was definitely in 2025. Obviously, we are now in 2026, so we have definitely missed a couple of weeks. And honestly, the holidays were extremely busy and a little crazy and stuff like that. So I apologize for the inconsistencies, and just the lack of recording. Obviously, as you guys know, I do work at the movies, so there's been a lot going on the last couple of weeks with the mixture of the holiday season wrapping up and having it be fairly busy at the movies, and then also thankfully I just got promoted. So kind of dealing with the promotion and doing some training and stuff like that. It's just been extremely hectic, and the end of the year definitely ended on a good note. But it was pretty busy and it was pretty hectic. So now that we kind of transitioned into the new year and I got some days off and I have some time to myself, I thought what better way to start off the new year than record an episode for the podcast and, kind of dive into 2026 on a good note. So, before we get into today's episode, real quick, I just want to kind of talk about like what my plans are for the podcast, um, going into 2026. So obviously, by the time I'm recording this, it's about January 12th. So this episode will not come out until the following Monday. So we're going about like halfway into January, and that is when the first episode for 2026 will be recorded. Um, Now going forward, I would like to at least put out an episode once a week. I would like to stay consistent with that. Choose a day that best works for everybody. I might do some research. I might figure out like what the best day to post a video is, and like what time to post it around, just so you guys kind of get the best optimal viewing experience that you could possibly get. So like I said, obviously at the end of this video, we'll go over the social medias, where you can follow me, to stay in tune for all the notifications and stuff, for when this episode releases. Um, but like I said, going into the new year, I definitely want to stay more consistent. I'm probably going to have a lot more days off, with the promotion, and then also just being relatively slow at the movies for now. There are a couple movies that are coming out in both January and February that I'm going to want to see. So there'll be plenty of videos, to be made in regards to that. I think I'm just going to start fresh for 2026. I know there were some movies that I didn't cover from 2025, but I figure, what, it's already the new year. I just want to start off on a fresh foot, and I just want to talk about movies that are happening this year. Um, so yeah, so going forward, like I said, I just want to be a little bit more consistent when it comes to the podcast. Something that I also want to do is that I also want to branch out, and I also want to cover, besides movies, I also want to cover TV shows. I think the TV shows will mostly be like live action TV shows. So for example, we do have a new Game of Thrones series coming out relatively soon, called The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. So obviously, you guys seem to really enjoy my breakdown and analysis of House of the Dragon, especially the second season. It's probably like some of the most viewed videos on my channel and for the podcast. So I am definitely going to sit down and do a review for each of those episodes. I'm sure there are more TV shows and stuff that I'm going to watch this year, whether it's animated or live action. But I'm going to do my best to try to break down those episodes and those TV shows as they come out, and see if you guys enjoy it. I think I'm going to stick away from anime. We tried it on the podcast a couple of years ago, and it was relatively positively received. But it seems like you guys enjoyed more of our live action TV show breakdowns. There might be, like I said, a couple of animated shows that I might break down. Whether it's Star Wars or Marvel. But I definitely want to dive into a little bit more TV shows. Um, and finally, last but not least, there's two more things. Going into this year, I definitely want to get into a little bit more cosplay. I went to my first Comic Con last year, Tampa Bay Comic Con, and I dressed up, two of those days, and I actually really enjoyed it. It just felt really nice to like be able to kind of like nerd out, and be surrounded by people that are exactly like me. Um, so going forward, besides obviously being a podcast, I haven't decided if I'm going to do it on like my main Instagram or social medias, or if I'm going to use um, the podcast platform as a way to showcase those. But I definitely want to put together some cosplays, and I want to get a couple like photos and stuff done. And I think besides posting the podcast episodes um, on these social medias, I think I'm also going to start posting some cosplays. So there might be two Comic Cons that I might be going to this year. So because of that, I might be dressing up. So I think those will be maybe some of the first cosplays that I do, or I might just maybe invest in cosplays in my own time and maybe take pictures like that. But let me know if that's something that you guys would be interested in. I definitely am interested in it. It's definitely a goal that I have for myself in 2026. So let me know. Let me know if you're interested, because that would be really cool. And then last but not least is that I want to make the podcast a little bit more personable, instead of kind of like reading information like, off of a computer, or, having, the stats written down. I want to give you my honest review, my honest opinions, give you my positives and negatives and stuff like that, and, be a little bit more natural. So the videos might be a little bit shorter, but that might help out because people, tend to enjoy a little bit of a shorter video than a long form video. So they might be, at least 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes max. So again, let me know if you guys like that format, if you want shorter videos, shorter reviews, or if you prefer more longer form videos. I don't mind doing either. But that's pretty much it. So like I said, if you guys are not subscribed to the podcast now, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all under Tucson's podcast. There was an O, not a U, because we are two brothers. So I'll post on Instagram and TikTok whenever the episodes are out. Usually it would be some sort of picture, or it might be like a TikTok. Kind of like showing a preview of like the movie or a scene for the movie, or TV show, and then there will be like a little caption attached to it. Basically saying like, oh hey, the video's out. Come view it. And yeah, and then obviously the videos will be available on YouTube. I'm not as tech savvy as my brother, so I don't know how to like post it to Spotify and like all the other streaming platforms. So they are only available on YouTube. So whether you just listen to the audio or you watch the video as well, that's where you can find it. Again, the YouTube is Two Sons Podcast. Those with an O, not a U, because we are two brothers. So once again, I'll remind you guys at the end of the video, but for now, let's jump into our first review of 2026. So, the first review of 2026 is going to be a little bit of an interesting one, actually. We are going to be following one of A24's first films of the year, and not only that, but one of their first horror films. Or you could, relatively argue that this is the first horror film of the year. Like I said, the studio that produced it was A24 and Paramount Pictures. And we are going to be covering the movie Primate. So the movie Primate came out on January 9th of 2026. So it just came out actually this weekend. Um, we see that it was directed by Johannes Roberts, and if you guys are curious who that man is, he's also directed such films as 47 Meters Down, The Strangers, Pray at Night, Resident Evil, Welcome to Raccoon City, and The Other Side of the Door. Um, we see that it's also written by him as well as Ernest Riera, and it is produced by Walter Hamada. Now, Walter Hamada, he's also produced such films such as The Conjuring in 2013, Annabelle in 2014, The Conjuring 2 in 2016, Lights Out in 2016, and It in 2017. So we see that it is actually directed and produced by some heavy hitters when it comes to horror films and franchises. I would say, you're probably going to be more familiar with Walter Hamada, and what they produced. Maybe not Johannes Roberts. I mean, obviously, I hear 47 Meters Down was a relatively good film. I'm not really too familiar with the Strangers franchise as well as Resident Evil and that movie, so I don't think that was very well received. And like I said, Strangers, and then the other project I haven't heard of. But obviously, Walter Hamada, I've heard of all of these. And they are some pretty big movies, The Conjuring universe, Annabelle, Lights Out, and especially It. Um, So we see, besides it being directed by Johannes Roberts and produced by Walter Hamada, we see that it was obviously distributed by Paramount Pictures. The music was done by Adrian Johnson. Um, we see obviously the release date. It actually released September 18th, 2025 during the Fantastic Film Festival, but it officially released to the public and in the United States on January 9th of 2026. So it has a runtime of 89 minutes. The budget for this film was around anywhere between 21 to 24 million dollars. According to some box office reports, we're seeing numbers such as 13.4 million dollars. We're seeing that obviously because it's the beginning of the year. That so far the movie has performed well at the box office. It debuted with about a $4.5 million opening for its opening weekend, and currently it earned about 11.3 million. I assume that number has jumped obviously to 13.4 since this last projection. It is currently ranked number 2 in the domestic box office, following Avatar: Fire and Ash, which is actually relatively surprising because Zootopia 2 is also out still, and that movie has made like $1.5 billion. So the fact that it kind of surpassed Zootopia 2 and it took the number 2 spot is relatively interesting, and it obviously bodes well for the film. I mean, I do think it will be out for a couple more weeks, so there is a possibility that it is going to at least make its budget back, which will be a relatively, simple success, especially with like a B-rated project as itself. When it comes to a movie like this, Primate, obviously this is not your blockbuster hit. This is not where you get all your Emmys and all your Oscars. This is just a casual film, for some casual horror fans, or just casual fans of A24 and the projects that they put out. Um, so that's a little bit of the making of the film as well as the box office report. Now we're just going to quickly touch upon some of the cast and crew. Give them shout outs and let you guys know who was in the film. So we have a couple of characters. Obviously some stand out more than the others. Really, the two main characters of the film are going to be Lucy and her sister Kate. We see Lucy is played by Johnny Sequoia. We see one of her friends, Hannah, is played by Jessica Alexander. Their father, Adam, is played by Troy Koster, who is actually a deaf actor in real life. We see her sister Kate is played by Victoria Wyatt. One of her friends, Erin, is played by Gia Hunter. We have Aaron's brother, by the name of Nick, being played by Benjamin Chang. We have the two boys that come to the house looking to have a good time with the girls. Drew and Brad. We have Drew being played by Charlie Mann, and we have Brad being played by Tien Simone. We have Ben, the actual practical suit actor that was actually mimicking the chimpanzee, and it was not CGI. It was actually all practically shot in a suit, by the name of Miguel Hernando Torres Umba. And that's pretty much it. Any of the other characters just didn't have enough screen time, or they just weren't important. But all the characters that I listed, the family and the friends and the two guys is basically the most important cast and crew that you're gonna need to know for this film, especially the actor that played Ben, because like I said, one of the positives that we'll get into about this film is that it was not CGI animated. I assume it was probably a combination of both motion capture and a practical suit. And I mean, it looked phenomenal. It actually looked like a real life chimpanzee. So they did a really good job. Going forward into this new year, I think we're actually going to only focus the reviews for both the critics and the audience. Through Rotten Tomatoes. Rotten Tomatoes is probably one of the more popular and heavy hitters when it comes to the movie theater industry as well as TV shows. We usually also did Metacritic and IMDb, but honestly, I think Rotten Tomatoes breaks it down a little bit more perfectly, especially when it comes to the critics and then both the audience. So we see that originally the film debuted with I think about like a 92 or 93% on Rotten Tomatoes according to the critics, which was actually a phenomenal score considering the type of movie that this is. We see obviously now that it came out to the public officially, its opening weekend, we see that that score has gone down, but it's still maintaining a certified fresh rating of about 78% on the tomato meter, according to the critics, which is a great score. I mean, obviously it's a C plus, B minus, which is why it's kind of called like a B tier film. but we also see that it's certified fresh. So, that's a great standing to have according to Rotten Tomatoes. We see that the popcorn meter, so how the audience has felt about it, is sitting around the same percentage. It's sitting at about 72%, so it's a little bit lower rated, for the consumer compared to the critics. But overall, I think for what the film was, I think these are pretty accurate scores, and I think these are well deserved. I mean, I think personally, the popcorn meter could be a little bit higher, maybe like the high 70s. But I think these are both perfect scores to kind of show, what the critics thought about it, and then also what the audience saw about it. So we see that we have this A24 horror film, one of the first ones of the year for both A24 and just horror fans in general. We see that it's kind of like a B tier, movie. Obviously, it's second at the box office currently. It's on projection to probably make back its budget. And we see that overall it is given relatively good scores by both the critics and the audience, and it has a decent cast and crew. Obviously, like there are no notable names that stick out, besides the director and the producer. But the cast and crew and the characters in the film, I think were relatively convincing for the roles that they played. I don't think anybody stand out for me in particular, except for the actor that played Ben, obviously. But I don't think their acting was also poor or unwarranted. It just wasn't like a huge standout performance. Going a little bit into the critics consensus, nice, short, sweet, to the point. That's one bad ape, and Primate is one lean, mean, effective chiller. So again, it's the perfect creature horror to start out the year for 2026. If you like a little body gore, if you like a little creature horror, a lot of people are comparing Primate to Kojo. So if you're a big fan of Kojo or just creature horrors like that, apparently the director and the producer, they actually took inspiration from Kojo, and I think the director actually took also some inspiration from his own family dog that unfortunately probably suffered the same fate. So that is definitely very interesting. Um, Audiences reviews, they're anywhere from a 4.5 out of 5 stars, 1 star. We're seeing a lot of 4.5, 5 stars, some 3 stars. So obviously reviews are all over the place. Again, a lot of people are referring to it as a B movie with a budget. We see some other complaints here and there, but overall it's getting positive reviews. So, now that we covered the cast and crew, we covered the reviews, we covered the budget and a little bit about the film. Now we're just gonna simply kind of go into my positives and negatives and what I thought about the film. So for a 90-minute horror film, I think Primate does a fairly good job. We're gonna jump into the negatives real quick before we delve a little bit deeper into the positives. Negatives, I think something that stood out for me, at least in the beginning of the film, is that I think the pacing in the beginning of the film is a little poor. I wish they would have kind of spent a little bit more time, properly diagnosing Ben, and like, I wish we kind of would have saw what happened, and how he basically contracted rabies. Because they kind of obviously allude to it, they show the dead mongoose, in his enclosure. And, obviously you find out later in the film that, it tests positive for rabies. But I think seeing that sequence of kind of Ben go from this like family friendly chimpanzee that everybody loves, and then actually seeing the sequence where the mongoose, gets into his enclosure and bites him, I think would have added a little bit more depth, not only to the film itself, but also how we feel about Ben. And I think we just would have felt a little bit worse for him. Because obviously you see him in the beginning. He's a cute little chimpanzee, right? It's a relatively nice story about how he kind of gets introduced to the family, how he becomes a part of the family. So it's sad when you have to see these members of the family that loved him for so many years have to eventually turn on him and kill him. So I think seeing how he contracted rabies and then eventually saw how the rabies kind of took over him and changed his personality and his characteristics, I think would have been just a little bit more heart wrenching, and I think it would have pulled on people's heartstrings a little bit more. So I think the pacing for that could have been a little bit, and again, I mean, something like that would only took like maybe a minute or two. Um, so I think the pacing in the beginning of the film was a little poor. I don't think it was terrible, but I think, like I said, I think some sequences, such as maybe seeing how Ben contracted rabies and then how he slowly starts to succumb, they do a good job towards the beginning of the film kind of showing a couple of examples of, okay, this is a little aggressive or this is a little weird for him. Some of the ways that Ben interacts with some of the friends or even some members of the family, it's a little aggressive. It's a little out of character. So you kind of start to see like, okay, there might be something wrong. Um, but I think just adding a little bit more, like a little bit of like a pinch more of that, and like I said, as well as also showing how he contracted the rabies to begin with, I think would have really just put the icing on the cake, and it would have made you, like I said, feel a lot worse for both the family and Ben. I think also giving some time to kind of flush out some of the characters. I mean, we're given a very quick backstory about who this family is, who the mother was, what she did, how Ben came into their lives. We're given that through, maybe 5 minutes or less of like news articles and clips that kind of play at the beginning of the movie. There are some things that they kind of touch upon in the movie. There are a lot of like, little small subplots like, the mother being a linguist. And then that's how she brought Ben into the family because as a linguist, she was trying to develop a way for, I guess, primates or chimpanzees to communicate with humans. So obviously Ben knew sign language. He was able to use a tablet to kind of like express his thoughts and opinions. But then we see that she died of cancer. So we don't really see too much how that affected the family. I mean, obviously we see that the older sister, Lucy, has spent time away from home, and because of that, it's kind of strained her relationship with her father and her sister. But it would have been a little bit nicer to kind of delve deeper into the backstory of Ben and how he kind of became part of the family. I think throughout the film, if maybe we saw like some flashback sequences or just Lucy or Kate just talking about Ben and their mother and how they became part of the family, I think again would have added a little bit more depth to the characters, so you would have felt a little bit stronger connections towards the characters, towards the family. But then you also would have felt more of a connection to Ben because, again, just kind of seeing how this relationship was built and fostered and um, developed into a real family unit, I think just would have added a lot more depth to the characters personally. But then again, I think it would have tugged a little bit harder at your heartstrings, and I think it would have gotten people a little bit more invested in the film. Um, so I think just allowing a little bit more time for some of these minor subplots to kind of be fleshed out. Um, Obviously at the end of the film, we kind of see the family come full circle, and unfortunately this tragic event kind of brought them closer together, and their bond is kind of like restored. But like I said, I think kind of sprinkling in a little bit more of a backstory on like who their mother was and how it really affected them, like when she died of cancer, how she brought Ben into the family, and how they kind of all felt about Ben and stuff like that. I think adding a little bit more of a sprinkle of that, just as I mentioned before with Ben contracting rabies, I think would have definitely added a lot more to the story. um, Besides some pacing issues in the beginning of the film, I think some of the other character subplots were just unnecessary. I think the little like jealousy between Lucy and then I believe the friend's name is Jessica, over her friend Nick, I think was just a little unnecessary. I think the subplot with the two guys, was a little unnecessary. I think the only reason why they were kept in the film was for Ben to have two really cool death scenes back to back. Um, like I said, I think some of these little subplots when it comes to the relationship between Lucy and her friends was just a little unwarranted, and it didn't really add anything to the film. I'm not saying it took anything away from the film, but it didn't also add anything to the film either. So it kind of seems like just like unnecessary. What else? Besides some early on pacing issues and some minor subplots that were just kind of unnecessary. That's really the only two complaints that I kind of had with the film, to be honest. Like I said, those were really my two major issues, really. Like I said, I think if the pacing was fixed a little bit, during the first act, and I think some of the subplots with the other characters were either fleshed out more or they were just scrapped altogether. I think it would have added a little bit more to the film. Like I said, I could see it going up to maybe like a proper like B minus for both the critics and the audience. Um, Now we're going to dive into some positives because I do think there were a lot of good positives with this film, and this is actually why I think this film is kind of a little underrated. Obviously, having a producer, such as that guy that we went over earlier, him being a kind of like a veteran to different horror franchises, First of all, I think the soundtrack and I think the music was very John Carpenter. It was very reminiscent of like Halloween and kind of like that atmosphere. So I think the soundtrack and I think the music behind the film fit the scene really well. Talking about the scene, I think the landscape and the setting for this film, being in Hawaii, having something so beautiful and so pure in nature, turn out to be like a horror, or a hell. Um, there's something interesting about them taking the beauty and the just awe-inspiring sight of nature and turning it into something so deadly. And I think this film does that very well, especially, the design of the house, where it's situated. They do a lot of clever things with that. Because the house is so isolated, it's hard for them to get in contact with the police and, contact like, other family and friends. Just the location of the house in general kind of sets up some interesting scenarios of like cat and mouse situations, and then also some death sequences, especially with Nick when he gets tossed off the edge of the pool. So I think the setting and just the background that they used for the film in Hawaii, I think was both beautiful, but it was also both unfortunate at the same time. Like I said, taking such a beautiful and just iconic setting and turning it into like a nightmare fueled 24 hours, I think was such a interesting and such a smart choice. um so they definitely get points for that. Cinematography wise, I mean, that just kind of go hand in hand with what I just mentioned. When it came to the cast and crew, I think some of the characters, I think they acted fairly well. I mean, again, there were no like, star-studded performances, but I didn't think any of the performances were bad too. I mean, I've seen some people complain about the family and, this and that and blah blah blah. And how they should be thrown in jail and stuff like that. And I mean, yeah, I mean, if we're really gonna deep dive into like a film like this and kind of go that route, sure. But I think for what it was on paper, I think, all the actors and actresses, I think they gave, a well worthy performance. I mean, I've already seen some clips of Lucy, being one of the first, final horror girls of the year. So people are already obsessed with, that actress in particular, than some of the other ones as well. I've seen plenty of other edits. So there is, a small following growing for some of these actors, and a movie like this could obviously, catapult them into, new stardom and new roles. Obviously, one of the standout performances is the actor that plays Ben. Just their usage of like a practical suit and just being able to kind of capture all the facial expressions and the emotions of Ben, and especially like, those, aggressive, fight sequences, and just, some of the kills that they came up with were just so creative and just so gory, and it was really a good film. It was very unsettling. It kept you on the edge of your seat, and some of those like just some of those fight sequences and some of those death sequences were just like, oh, like, I mean, they open up the film with one where like he just rips a guy's face off, and it's like, that's a hell of a way to start a film. um so I think with some relatively good acting, along with the kind of feeling that, I think besides the maybe some parts of the first act, it was relatively well paced. So for constantly just being on your seat, just over like every move they made, like whether they tried to escape the pool or they went into the house, or like just it constantly had you on the edge of your seat. And I think what was so good about that is because you take a character like Ben, who is, obviously a chimpanzee. So you take that animalistic primal nature that's going to be enthralled because of the rabies, and you put that behind intelligence. And he is literally just becoming like a serial predator. And he is literally just stalking this family and their friends the whole entire film. And, just some of the ways he, like I said, kills and, torments these characters. It's very impressive, and it's very well done. Um, but I think that's it. So like I said, I think some of the negatives, I think, like I said, there were some minor pacing issues, towards the beginning of the film that I think could have been worked on a little bit more. There are some subplots that I think that could have been explained and fleshed out a little bit more, or just scrapped altogether. Positives, however, I think, the characters in the cast, they give a relatively good performance. Obviously, the use of motion capture and a practical suit for Ben, I think, makes the character stand out really well, and it makes the film look even better. The cinematography and the setting for the film, like I said, just having that Beautiful scenery, turned into like kind of like a hellish nightmare. Is very creative and very interesting. It was directed very well. It was produced very well. And especially, the music and the soundtrack behind the scenes just really kind of made you feel like you were in some sort of twisted Halloween type universe. Um, so I definitely think that this film is worth a watch. I would pay full price for this. I would pay a discounted price for this, whatever you could afford. I definitely highly recommend going to watch this film and going to see this film. I think it is a very well done creature horror film, and I think it is a good one to start out with for 2026. Obviously, 2026 is going to have tons of different horror reboots and horror movies, so it'll be interesting to see where this one kind of lands towards the end of the year. But I think overall, I think it's a great film to start out 2026, and it's definitely one that I wanted to do a review on, so I'm glad I did. So like I said, if you haven't already, I would highly recommend you go check out Primate. I think A24 started this year on a relatively good note. I think they knew what this film was going to be when they released it, and I think they'll be pleasantly surprised when people actually enjoy it a lot more than they probably thought they would. But that is going to do it for today's episode, guys, where we start off January of 2026, or just 2026 in general, with a bang. And we talk about A24's newest project, Primate. So if you guys are looking for more episodes like this and you're wondering where you can find more lovely content like this, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok, all under Two Sons Podcast. So it's with an O, not a U, because we're two brothers. Like I said, I always post, any pictures or videos, kind of going over the episodes and when they're out. So if you guys follow me on those socials, you'll be able to know when the episode comes out. Now, if you're wondering where you can watch this episode, I am on YouTube at Two Sons Podcast. That is with an O, not a U, because we're two brothers. So these episodes will come out. Like I said, I'm still going to try to figure out a day that kind of works best for everybody. So just really have those notification bells on. Follow me on those socials so that way you guys are updated for when this video finally posts. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming out to the first video of 2026. Hopefully this is a great year for the podcast. I did see that we were at 100 subscribers, so it's just kind of crazy to think that there's 100 people that love to listen to me rant and rave and talk about movies. So I'm excited to see where the podcast can go and what movies we can cover. It's supposed to be a great year for movies, so there's going to be a lot of good episodes to do. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for coming out to another episode. And until I see you guys again, have a good day, have a good afternoon, good evening. Please be safe. Don't do anything stupid. And yeah, hopefully you guys are having a great start to the new year. Goodbye for now.